You're listening to What's Contemporary Now, a show about culture and the people, places, and things that together make it up.
Tish Weinstock is someone you should know if you don't already. Whether or not she thinks of herself as an it girl, she'd certainly be our avatar definition for the label if there were such a thing as a dictionary on What's Contemporary Now. Having spent a decent amount of time weaving words across the pages of your favorite titles, as well as being caught in front of the camera and even on the runway, conversation with her ended up being quite fun in that sort of unfiltered way that always sounds best when they're British. Strolling through her storied life, we discuss her era as an intern, the accidental stumble into beauty, and a recent journey to America when she visited a trauma camp that of course sounded as fun as it did meaningful. Oh, and her latest love, her very own Substack.
This is Tish Weinstock, and we're talking about What's Contemporary Now.
Tish Weinstock, as someone who listens to the show, you do know that we always start at the beginning and ask everybody about the early days that were quite formative in setting someone upon the path they tread today. So who was Tish Weinstock before the one we now know?
Okay, so my origin story, I was born in London. I grew up in London in a very traditional household. The sort of dominant culture was classical music and sort of pointless antiques, or what I perceived to be pointless at the time. Now I'm obsessed with, but like little pots that I felt didn't really do anything. And I couldn't really identify with this culture. I thought it was quite stuffy and I couldn't really relate to it. Another sort of characteristic about my household, I sadly lost my father when I was 5. There was a very palpable sense of grief growing up. And I think that really informed me and my tastes. And I found that I gravitated towards culture that felt a little bit darker and a little bit weirder and freakier. On film, that was The Addams Family. I loved Winona Ryder, Beetlejuice, Ghost World. Films and shows with female characters were quite sardonic and sarcastic and a little bit sour. I really identified with those creatures. And then I loved fashion, but I didn't really understand it to be fashion. I would pore over my mum's magazines. I want to say they were Vogue, but probably Tatler, if I'm being honest. But for me, I thought all the ad campaigns were really major, like Tom Ford era Gucci and Saint Laurent. I would cut them out, stick them on my wall. They'd be next to my posters of Buffy and Angel. And then Estella Warren as the face of Chanel. That was huge for me. Carmen Cast with her G-shaped pubes. I thought that was really dangerous and like exotic and fantastical. And I was like, that is my jam. And then also I really connected to art. I remember seeing a painting by a Belgian artist called Paul Delvaux called Sleeping Venus in the Tate. And it was like this nude in a town square, in a classical town square, surrounded by a skeleton and an automatron. And it was like surrealist and very dark and spooky. And I really connected with that. And then I remember learning at school the sort of Gothic writers, and Frankenstein was a big part of my growing up. And then also I was at St. Paul's Girls' School and we were doing an art history teaser and I learned about the artist Hans Bellmer and I was like, he's my jam, which looking back probably is quite weird. He created these life-like dolls out of severed body parts. He's created these out of, I think, wood and paper mache, and they were wearing Mary Jane shoes and socks. And he used to put them in really sexually suggestive poses.
And how old were you at this point?
I don't know, I was like a teenager.
Yeah.
But I was like, this is great, love this. And then I moved from St. Paul's Girls' School at sixth form because I grew up in a household of all women. My mum, my 2 older sisters. My elder sister voluntarily went to boarding school. My middle sister was sent because classic middle child syndrome. We had a dog. She was also a bitch. And it was like very fit female heavy. And I was surrounded by all these very academic women at St. Paul's. And I was like, I just need to get away from these she-devils. So I went to Westminster, which was another day school, but it was co-ed. I specialized in history of art, history, English, and art. And it was a very traditional school. And even though I had a great sort of admiration for fashion, I remember seeing the Gucci show, Tom Ford's Gucci show. I think it was like spring, summer 03. And it was like with all the kimonos and the blossom dresses. And I remember saying to my mom, I was like, oh, I want one of those dresses. And she was like, well, obviously not. You're 13, that's not happening. But I just remember being obsessed with objects and stuff and clothes. Within the education that I was exposed to, fashion was not an option. So I was like, okay, I'll do art history then. And I went and did art history at Oxford. for 3 years. But before that, actually, I got my first taste of working in fashion completely by accident. It was like while I was at Westminster. My friend was just like, oh, come over to my house and we can hang. And she failed to tell me that she had a full photo shoot in her house. So I just rocked up and I was like, oh, who are all these people? And it was Chloe Kerman, who was the fashion editor of Tank magazine at the time. And she was doing a shoot for O magazine, which was Tank was doing. I don't think it exists anymore. Anyway, it was a sort of like young London girl situation. And actually I ended up being in the shoot. But I was speaking to Chloe all about what she did. And I was like, this sounds amazing. I really want to intern with you. And so after school finished, I went and interned at Tank, where I was like that little bitch making tea and coffee. And then after Oxford, I was like, should I be a curator or should I maybe try and do this fashion thing? And I still hadn't worked out what it meant to work in fashion. I liked the idea of being in a magazine. I thought it was really chic and glamorous. Lol. And then I messaged Chloe Kerman. She was then at Garage magazine. I was like, can I come and be your bitch again? And she was like, yeah, of course. I loved having you. And so I did that. And that was when I realized the difference between a fashion intern and a sort of editorial intern, which I didn't know the difference before. At the beginning, I was dragging around a really large suitcase, printing out maps of East London, being like, oh, I really don't know where I'm going. And at one point, I had to get like an illegal minicab, which was not a wise plan. The guy was really dodgy, but I was like, I just need to get rid of these fucking clothes, man. Then at one point I was like, can I do some writing for the site? And I remember they let me do that. And so I remember writing something about what to wear if you were a witch based on the latest collections. And so that was my first taste of writing. And I was like, oh, wait, I really like this.
Had that already been on your radar before?
No, I had kept a diary when I was younger. I was always like a very shy person and I found it quite hard to speak to people. So I was always like the observer, like cast in the role of observer. I was always drinking it all in. And I loved writing essays. And I guess writing still feels like that now, like homework, which you hate having to do, but doing it nonetheless. So yeah, I was into writing from Oxford, but I guess that was like a different sort of style of writing. But I remember reading other titles and like really soaking it all in and being like, oh, I really like this. I remember I met Dean Kissick at Tank and I messaged him being like, can I come and intern for you at ID after my Garage internship was over? I was like the queen of interns. No one wanted to hire me, but they would happily have me there for free.
But wasn't that also the era of employing?
Yeah, it was the era where like you would just like intern number 1, intern number 2.
Mm-hmm.
And actually when I was at ID, one of my first like big think pieces was called I'm an intern, not an idiot. All about how like being an intern sucks. And I remember because it was owned by Vice at the time and Vice was like being sued by these interns in America because it's Vice. Are we surprised? Anyway, so someone came like running up the stairs from Vice being like, you need to take this down. But then I was like, wow, writing is powerful. Even though I wasn't really that successful in tearing down the establishment on that occasion, I was like, oh, your words matter actually. That I found quite empowering. So yeah, then I was just at ID and finally they put a ring on it and I was hired for editorial assistant. And then I just went up through the ranks there.
Something really interesting about that journey as well is the fact that if I read accurately, you never intended on becoming a beauty writer. So let's talk about how you stumbled into that role, because obviously it's one that you have maintained through to present day.
I was very surprised that beauty happened because I didn't really give a fuck about beauty. And sometimes I'm like, do I? I got into beauty. I was features editor of ID. And the features, apart from interviewing really hot skaters, my other interests lay in what I saw was this big change happening at the time. So I remember interviewing really early on Paloma Alcesta. She was first talking about ideas of body positivity and sort of self-acceptance. And that felt really radical. It still obviously feels radical today. It felt really different at the time. And then Petra Collins was ushering in her new language of feminism and femininity. And so that was happening. Then we had characters like Fecal Matter doing insane makeup in their bedrooms. Well, not even their bedrooms, but there was a lot of drag artists doing things in their bedrooms. And thanks to Instagram, we were suddenly being flooded with all these images of alternative ideals of beauty, talking about inclusivity and diversity. And it was all bubbling away. And I didn't see the connection instantly until I suddenly took a step back and I was like, oh, I guess I'm interested in beauty. not mascara and lip gloss and foundation and I don't know, whatever else one might have in their makeup kit. I was just interested in how beauty was being seen as a vehicle for self-expression, a platform to talk about identity and all these other very nuanced discussions that I wasn't seeing anywhere else. So it felt really new and exciting. And then there was the whole explosion of beauty. Then there were all these celebrity beauty brands and people started taking notice of beauty. And I think fashion has always been a bit perhaps snobby when it comes to beauty. I think there's very much let's church versus state. But I think now there's been this embrace of the two. And that's my interest, the sort of intersection between the two. It's less about these are the products that you should buy and more about how people use beauty to communicate something about identity, all the world in which we live. And actually what was key at the time was Isabelle French. She was doing really exciting things in the beauty space, doing things that I'd never seen before. Yeah, of course, people have been very expressive with their makeup. Historically, it's very much part of, especially the British subcultural landscape, post-war subcultural landscape, but she was doing something really interesting. And so when she decided to launch Dazed Beauty, I went and did that with her. And that felt really exciting. She was using a lot of AI technology. And at the time, people were like, what is this? This is not beauty. But I think she was very ahead of her time. And now look.
No, it's so true. But do you also see a correlation between your early years and having spent a lot of time alone and been more interested in these darker side of things, and then fast forwarding to this kind of interest in the fringes and subversion and how those things manifest in culture in the ways you're describing?
Totally. I think it all makes sense. And that's why I think beauty was so unlikely a space for me to end up in, because beauty traditionally is about selling an ideal, selling an image of perfection, whether it's youth or this idea of perfection, whatever that means. If you aren't born with it, buy it using these 10 products. And so it was a surprise to end up in that space. But actually, what I found interesting was those individuals doing something to challenge the status quo, like subvert these accepted norms. And I was interested in people doing weird stuff, like fecal matter, for example, their monstrous idea of beauty, I find really fascinating. And yeah, I was drawn into the weird and wonderful. So it all does make sense.
In your own experience as a creative and also in your observations of those that you've interviewed over the years, don't you find that incredible creativity is often rooted in an interest in what fascinates oneself versus an overanalysis of what's happening everywhere else? Isn't that where good work comes from?
Oh, completely. And you can definitely tell within my own work. I've written some articles before for another fashion title about Meghan Markle's blow dries, and I don't give a fuck about that. And you can tell in my writing that I don't care about it. Or like Hailey Bieber's ass crack. But those are topics that I had to do for traffic or for whatever it is. So I've definitely written my fair share of terrible pieces based on stuff that I have absolutely zero interest in. But yeah, you can tell when someone's interested in something and it feels authentic, that's when creativity flourishes.
Do you think that the medium of writing is under threat as we see more and more people just deferring to a ChatGPT generated article, or to your point, some banal subject matter for the purpose of traffic? Or do you still feel like some of those examples you were pointing to with the early days of ID resonate and have that virality to them?
Oh, I mean, ChatGPT, I fell down a bit of a hole with it the other day. I was like, oh, do something in the style of me. And then I got really into it, and then I went to quite a dark place. I was like, what do people think of me? That was really not advisable to do. It has its place. Is writing under threat? Actually, what has made me fall in love with writing again is Substack. I now do a weekly Substack, which is like a weekly digest of all the stuff I've done. And it's just a space that I can... It sounds so cringe, but be myself. It's like keeping a diary, or I never had a blog, but I guess it's similar. But it's a space where I can sort of write freely about things that interest me. When things are under threat, creativity will always flourish elsewhere. And I think we'll just keep on seeing new pockets of things like Substack, where a lot of writers, I feel like, are going to express themselves. Because, yeah, I think journalism today, or especially when you're on an online digital desk and when you're writing to fit your quota of traffic numbers and all of that, you're really dumbing yourself down. That shit can be done by ChatGPT, like SEOs and what is it called? Affiliates, all of that stuff. Let the machine do that. But there'll always be spaces where creativity thrives.
Absolutely. And the comment you made about Substack, obviously, as you mentioned, there are a great deal of established voices, whether or not they're writers in their day job or they're editors or whatever type of a creative, flocking towards a platform like Substack. And now we're starting to see magazines themselves move on to the platform. Why do you think that is? Is it about going where the people are?
Yeah, I think it's about going where the people are. And I think it's just a new medium to play around with and see what happens. It's like the old version of Instagram where people would upload, I don't know, just random shit that's not curated. What I like about Substack is it's not that highly curated. There's spelling mistakes and like shit punctuation and shitty sentence structures. It's just refreshing. I think brands are slightly, or trying to at least, move away from that highly polished, curated ideal. It's about being more real. And I think that's because audiences are crying out for that.
A few things we've brought up on the show numerous times are relatability and things like imposter syndrome. And it was particularly in the second season of this podcast that we found a lot of people were bringing it up. And I've read about it in interviews with you as well. And I wanted to tap into that because something that always fascinates me is, of course, the speed with which we're able to bridge the gap between people's perception of Tish Weinstock and themselves and how different those experiences must be, only to then hear that you too suffer from something like imposter syndrome or anxiety or whatever it might be at times. But then also the fact that you go on to do all of the things you do despite the human condition. So let's talk about some of the ways you find a remedy for that. You've mentioned getting off your phone, which is comical because you're very active on social media.
Oh my God, I'm also such a lie. I'm like, get off my phone. I never do. I'm full of shit.
So what do? You mentioned being more present, things like gratitude, both of which are obviously winning strategies, but what else could you share?
Definitely gratitude list. Earlier this year, I went to a trauma center in Nashville and it was like a week's course and no phone for a week. It was amazing. And they taught a lot about dispelling negative thoughts and they really encouraged us to do gratitude lists, which I really did at the beginning. But then I just got bored of being like, oh, I love my children and I'm so thankful for my children. I was like, oh, I hated the sound of my grateful voice. And I was like, no, I'm not fucking grateful. Life sucks. I'm like, I've got greed and avarice. I want this. And I was like a war between my many various voices, but they did help. When I was actively writing these lists, they did help. And another thing that they taught, which was about, let's say you're like, everyone hates me. That's the statement. You have to disprove it and prove whether it's a fact or just an opinion. And you're like, okay, can you prove that everybody ever in the entire world hates you? Or are there some people that don't hate you? So it's a great way to sort of intellectually to rethink about your negative or to challenge your negative thoughts and to soften the blow. And so instead of being like, everyone hates you, you're like, oh, maybe there are some people that might hate me, but there are some people that don't, and that's great. So it's just about reframing your thoughts, and that really helped. But equally, we are all very busy creatures. We're always surgically attached to our phones. We're dealing with micro and macro aggressions on the regs. It is really hard to be present, but actually not to harp on about Substack, but that's helped me be really present because I'm constantly like, oh my God, that would be great to do with my Substack. When my husband talks, I actually now listen, which is huge. So I'm like, oh, wait, you are funny and you are interesting. I'm going to write that down and pretend that's my own thought. But it is making me more engaging with the outside world and be like, oh, no, I am going to look at that exhibition and really take it in. So that has helped. But I think it is hard. It is hard to be present.
That's why they call these things a practice, right? It's not like you just do it and arrive and it's done. Was the place that you went to the Hoffman?
No, I want to do that. No, it was on site.
Okay, very interesting. And what was the catalyst for you deciding to go?
We had our friend staying with us towards the end of last year. She went to a similar place and she was like, it's amazing. And I guess I was feeling restless. I was like, oh, I need something to do. I've always known that I should go to somewhere and to work through childhood stuff and adult stuff, just stuff that keeps rearing its ugly face. Becoming a mother, there's no test to do, or there's no recce or like practice round. There's no practice round for life, full stop. And I think I just assumed that one just made an instant transition, just from child to adult to parent. But it just all happened. So I think I'm just playing catch up from all of those transitions. And I had allowed myself to be in a space where the negative voices were slightly winning. And I was like, you know what, I will go. And also I thought I'd meet some like interesting people there. That was really what I liked.
And did you?
I did. Yeah. Not the kind of interesting I thought. I met some very interesting people there. Some people that I just didn't expect to meet. I was the only person from London. I was the only European there.
Oh, wow. Okay. You chose that particular location because that's where your friend had gone.
No, she went to another one. I was like, I should go to the hardcore one. And so I did. And then I was like, I don't know if I like this. These aren't my people. But then you know what? It's like a movie. You suddenly realize that actually we are all the same and that we all have the same fears and insecurities, but also drives and ambitions and desires. And that was an amazing thing that I took out of it, which was that you can have completely different backgrounds and circumstances, but have a kind of common thread. It's in group. You're in your little groups. When I was in that cabin, I was like, these people know me more than anyone else in the world. And then when you leave the cabin, you're like, okay, no, we're all really different. But no, I love everyone I met. What I was surprised at was that there was no one I was the only European person. Because I know loads of people in Europe who have been to that specific one.
And is it something you would recommend others try?
Yeah, definitely. I think a week being without your phone does wonders.
That's why I thought it was the Hoffman experience or whatever.
No, I think clearly all of these wellness retreats are unanimous in their thinking about phones, which is the devil, obviously. So no phones is great, actually. And actually, when they gave it back, I was like, no, I don't need it. And then I switched it on thinking my phone's about to blow up. And it didn't. And I was like, oh, that's crazy. And like even Tom would stop texting me pictures of the kids. And I was like, I see how it is.
Well, surely they all knew that you weren't going to have a phone.
Yeah, but I was like, were you thinking about me at all? I thought I'd have a couple of exciting emails, but no, actually. I think it was just the time of year, maybe. That's what I keep telling myself.
A lot of those places and just kind of media in general talk a lot about things like intention and manifesting and being mindful of our thoughts and the way we feel and making sure those things are conducive to the outcomes that we're in pursuit of. But you, in How to Be a Goth, you write about embracing sadness, right? And strangeness and darkness as sources of power rather than weakness. When did you first feel safe kind of exploring that particular emotional range?
I think it's always been there. I remember the first art history project I did was on Hans Belmer, and that was when I was a teenager. So I think I've always felt safe to explore those avenues and those emotions in my writing. And I think it's come across in the people that I've gravitated towards to interview. I think it's always been there. But in terms of the book, I definitely didn't set out to be like, I want to write a story about sad, freaky people. I'd written an article for Vogue about Morticia Addams, pegged to the Tim Burton Wednesday series, and someone from the publishers messaged me and they were like, do you want to write a book about how to be a goth? And I was like, no way do I want to write a book about a subculture or a guide about how to live your life based on how I live mine. I was like, no, thank you. Also, I was scared that like online goth communities would come for me and I'd have to prove my gothic credentials. And then I was like, actually, I can find a way around this by telling stories of other women who have done things on their own terms and who have maybe gravitated towards a more macabre life aesthetic or point of view where their work is concerned. So that's how that happened. And also it tied in with the fact that the culture was embracing this sort of like darker attitude, whether that was in fashion, art, or film. We're having Beetlejuice 2, The Crow 2, Wednesday, Ethel Cain. Twigs was doing a lot of sort of releasing darker music with darker visuals. Doja Cat did that whole demonic thing. Culturally speaking, everyone was like gravitating towards the shadows. And I think that was just 100% a response to the shitstorm that was happening around us and still sadly is. I think dark culture is always a response to dark socio-political events. And I think it's a way for the world to come to terms with all the terrible things that are happening. So I was definitely really seeing that. You know, that film with Russell Crowe in A Beautiful Mind, when he like sticks all these things to the wall and he's, oh, it's connected. Like I was like that during the book writing process. Everything is connected and we're all responding to these really quite horrifying things happening in the world.
Well, it is interesting because at first glance, you look at that sort of manifestation of darkness and think, oh, it's dark. And historically, people would say that Marilyn Manson was satanic or whatever. But the way you describe it is almost a source of not just power, but solace, which I find so interesting as a way of dealing with a lot of the kind of cognitive dissonance caused by the events of the world.
Yeah. It's about leaning into the unknown. I mean, we're all scared of the unknown. And I think a way to come to terms with that is by like leaning into it and accepting it and familiarizing yourself with the dark edges of things. And I think it's about not trying to deny it. So I think psychologically, it's just making us more accepting of the things that are happening. It's been comforting for me since being a kid. I mean, I always felt drawn to those witchier characters and the princess because I was like, I can't really be a princess. So I'll just stick to what I know and be really familiar with that and become empowered by that. And I guess it's about being authentic. So yeah, I think it's definitely a cultural embrace of darkness is a way to come to terms with harsh realities.
You've also made comments that a lot of people are sort of getting more into spirituality and witchcraft these days. Do you think it's for the same reasons you're talking about?
Yeah, I think because we have no control over the world we're in. We have no control over our everyday. Women, our control over our bodies is becoming undermined by the day. Everyone, no matter who you are, there's little control over your life. And I think there's a sort of resignation to the fact that, you know, let's look to the stars for guidance, or there must be something out there that can make sense of all of this crazy stuff that's happening. And I think there's something comforting about, leaving your fate up to maybe some tarot cards. What I thought was interesting is, I can't remember who I was talking to about it, but the idea of tarot, even if tarot isn't going to predict your future, psychologically, it will help you to understand how you feel about something. Okay, let's say, am I going to get this job? And the card is like, no. Then I might be like, okay, well, actually, that's fine. I might learn something about myself in the process because of this prompt, this external prompt. And so I think there is definitely a place for spirituality and all of that kind of those witchier things. And a lot of people love manifestations as well. Oh God, what's it? The Secret.
Yeah, back in the day.
I read that. Some of it I was like, oh, I really resonate. And then other bits I was like, no, this is not. Sorry, no. I liked the positivity. She's very positive about being the architect of your own sort of luck. I think there's definitely a place for that. In times of uncertainty, it's nice to sort of look to like something that isn't human for guidance, because look at all the humans who have led us astray. But yeah, I think it's comforting to look at the stars.
It also gives you some weird sense of control in a world full of chaos, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You've actually also mentioned wanting to start a podcast of your own, saying that you wanted it to be about beauty, identity, and style, a place to celebrate those who live their look, do their thing, and refuse to conform. So before we get into the dream guest, what sort of things are you personally rebelling against these days?
In terms of like rebelling, that's what I'm drawn to in people. I'm so much more of a pussy than the people that I surround myself with. And I love to surround myself with people who do subvert the status quo. And I think that's always interested me when it comes to my writing. What am I personally doing to tear up the rule book? God, I don't know. Actually, that's a really tough question.
I don't think it's like volunteer work or philanthropy as much as things that are happening in the world or the culture in particular that you feel averse to and just don't want to fuck with.
Would you know, I thought it was really interesting. I listened to Jonathan Wingfield's episode, and when he talks about rebelling against the algorithm, I thought that was really interesting because it's so true. We're seeing a lot of work that's so derivative and it's all about the references. We are in a bit of a scary place where that is concerned. And I think it's where do we go from here? How can we stand out in a sea of homogeneity? I'm curious to see what happens next with that.
I remember Mario Sorrenti told me in 2016, I want to say, whatever year Trump won the first time, it was literally on election day, comically, that he found with things like Google Images and Pinterest or Tumblr or whatever, people were suddenly being given the same references when they were doing their research and what was being spit back at them. And I just thought that was so interesting. And then more recently, MIT had done that study about the kind of effects on our intelligence with the frequent use of something like ChatGPT and how it's flattening a lot of retention of information and command over knowledge in a way that you historically had a great deal more of when you were writing it yourself, especially by hand. But in any case, it is interesting to hear you talk about references almost becoming a little bit of a homogenizing prison of sorts. Because going back to what you said earlier, I think there's always the opposite effect, right? For every bad, there's some reaction. So whether or not that's subversion or innovation, there's always something interesting that kind of comes from moments of flatline, wouldn't you say?
Totally. I was just also thinking about echo chambers, actually. Going back to being at onsite, I met people who were so ideologically the opposite to what I am. And that I thought was quite nuts. So the people I hang out with, they all think the same as me, relatively speaking. The industry that we all work in think the same, relatively speaking. But I was with people who think so differently to me politically and like socially. There was like a lot of sort of like angry young white men. And I just thought they didn't really exist. Or not that they didn't exist, but like, I would never really come into contact with them. And I was shocked to come into contact. And I was like, we'll never get on. But obviously there were common threads that we could find. There's people who like were there storming the Capitol on January the whatever it was.
6th.
Yeah, 6th. And I was like, what? This is insane. And they seem like a really normal person. And it was just so shocking to me that obviously I know people think differently to me, obviously, but it was crazy to meet someone and to not realize that upon first meeting. I don't know, I've got off on a complete tangent.
I think it's interesting. I feel like those types of containers for people to coexist in would probably benefit society at large if we did it more often.
Yeah, it was a safe space to be in, to have these kind of very intense conversations with people who are so ideologically opposed to you, but you can sort of work it out. Like Charlie and Lord, you work it out on the remix. I think it's very good to challenge your everyday. And I think we are all in danger of being in our own echo chamber where we're not listening to outside thought, we're not listening to outside ideas, and we're excluding an entire world out there. I'm not saying it's a better world, but I'm just saying I do think it's dangerous to be reinforced by our own ideas. I think it's dangerous for creativity and just future progress and being human. I think it's good to be aware of the whole spectrum.
You've talked about this kind of calmness that you've described as the wild unknown in the dark and the kind of peace that only exists when you step away from all this noise, right? So how does one even go about that? Because obviously theory is quite easy to discuss, but is it meditation? Is it a retreat similar to what you've done?
I like to sort of implement where I can wellness in my life because I'm a sort of extremely unwell individual. So I think I like to balance out these extremes. I'm so bad at meditating, but I've got an app. I've actually got a reminder on my phone to meditate in the morning, and I'm silencing it. So I like to meditate, but obviously I'm consumed with 1,000 million thoughts. But meditating is good. I've recently started doing Pilates and weight training because my core sucks and I've got back pains. Taking moments out. I like being in the countryside. I like being in nature. I think try and get away from your phone. And I find being with my kids makes me feel very present. That's not necessarily a good thing. You just have to be present with them or they're going to kill themselves or each other. So they demand presence. So that's quite good for me. But yeah, I think it's about having that balance and I'm someone that needs to always be doing something. I find it like holidays for me, I sort of spiral. It don't make sense to me. I'm someone that's always refreshing my emails. The Substacks really help me to focus on stuff. So like maybe if that's not your bag, maybe keeping a diary or just writing down notes. And I think journaling is like a big thing within the wellness industry. That's something that people say is really helpful. And I think this is a form of journaling. So yeah, just take any moment of calm where you can, whatever it is, however you get it, going to the cinema or I don't know. I think we're so starved of calmness that wherever you can get it, you should try.
What about extreme examples of things like getting a dumb phone or sober living or any of the things we've seen merge in the past 4 years?
That would be the dream. If I could manage sober living, that would be great. I just love alcohol and I love processed food. I love going to bed late. I have to wake up early for my kids. I love being in a state of anxiety the whole time. So I'm my own worst enemy. But I do love also like getting a drip. I've been doing some like NAD drips. I've also been in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. What else have I done in the name of wellness? LED therapy, infrared sauna. Oh, I had this thing, EVO2, which was like literally having liver dialysis. But I actually did it when I was very hungover, which is apparently really not what you're meant to do. So that slightly defeated the whole thing. But it basically fills up this tank of receptacle of all of your toxicity, and mine was really high. I felt very embarrassed. I think at one point in my life, I'll nail it and I'll get rid of all of the bad things and I'll just live on a farm maybe and be happy. Finally. I think there's also, everyone gets in a bit of ironically, they get in a state of high anxiety by trying to be, they're like, oh, I'm not doing the latest thing. I think it's about being kind to yourself and taking it easy. I think there's something to be said for that. It's the same with like self-acceptance. I think self-acceptance is obviously hugely important, but there are so many interviews, podcasts, or like people that I've listened to have been like, yeah, I used to have all these problems and now I love myself, which is always great. But I'm like, I don't get how you get there. Like, I don't get how you fully accept yourself. I can relate to all of the problem sides, but like, how do you get to the final step? And the answers that I really resonate with is when people say that it's a life's process. You don't fully accept yourself every day. It's not absolute self-acceptance, but it's a journey towards accepting yourself, which slightly takes the pressure off. It's about being kind to yourself and cutting yourself some slack.
You spoke beautifully about women over 50 and how they become fearless and magnetic when they take up space instead of disappearing. Michelle Lemy was one of the examples you mentioned that I recall. But don't you think those kind of tropes around aging in general have changed or evolved away? Or is that more in kind of city culture?
I think it's hard to say. Am I just reporting on the echo chamber with which I'm at the center of? I certainly feel that the attitude towards aging has changed. I was just thinking about Valentino Couture show, recent one, the casting, there was a lot of older women. And I think that was actually one of my favorite chapters writing. I was looking at Edith Sitwell and Louisa Casati and all these formidable women who were just so unapologetically themselves in later years. And I think that's something that I really aspire to, just being so confident in my skin and in myself and wearing whatever the fuck I want, saying whatever the fuck I want, and doing whatever the fuck I want. I came away from that feeling very hopeful indeed. I think this idea that a woman is supposed to wither away when she gets to a certain age to become invisible, I think we are totally challenging. And I think you should take up more space the older you get.
A beautiful thing. And are any dream guests for this podcast that we're looking forward to launching?
Oh my God, I would love to have Edith Sitwell on my podcast and Louisa Casati, the RIP. If I was going to have my dream guest, John Galliano.
Ooh, yes, your favorite.
Yeah, my favorite. He's amazing. I would love to have him on. I'd want to go to his house in France and have a sort of like a tea party with him and Auntie, his doll, and just talk about beauty and style and life and gossip. I'd want to just gossip with him. Maybe that shouldn't be recorded, actually.
I can't believe that we've gone this long and we haven't even talked about your modeling gigs. That was definitely something I wanted to touch upon. And given that you report as a journalist on all these different world builders, what was it like to find yourself as a character in someone else's creative narrative during, I guess the experience with John was one that I read about in particular that sounded very incredible.
Talk about imposter syndrome. That was also not on my bingo card, but it was such a joy to be a part of. I think when you're in the role of observer, writer, there's a sort of distance between you and whoever it is that you're observing and writing about. And when you're in their world and you're a part of the process and you're a player in whatever game that they're playing or actor in whatever performance they're conducting, it's a totally different story. Working with John was amazing. Walking for Chloe earlier this year was also fab, terrifying. And I was like, I'm going to throw up. And there was a moment when I was like, oh, I've gone the wrong way. Of course, like this has happened to me. I just don't know my left from my right. So I was like, fuck, what do I do? It was fine. I just followed the girl in front. And then I walked past my friends and my husband and I could hear them cheering for me, which is obviously sweet, but like fucking annoying. I like perfected my like dissociation. And they interrupted my meditation. And I was like, oh God, here I am. And I just got really self-conscious. I was like, that's so annoying. But it was obviously done with the best intention. And then also like working with Jürgen and Deauville, that was really special. I mean, it was less about me as the model and what I got out of it from doing that. It was more about being closer to the story, to the artist, to the characters. I mean, I remember being backstage at Chloe with Mona and she was like, oh, it's so great that you're here. And I was like, yeah, I don't know. But it's so fun to be here with everyone and to get really immersed in their worlds. And actually, in terms of casting, I love being at a show and seeing people who aren't maybe traditional models, because it gives you a point of relatability. You can see yourself in the clothes. So I think Miu Miu does that incredibly well. It's that unexpected character who pops up and you're like, oh, actually, okay, maybe I can wear that cone bra and it doesn't look insane. I think there's that sort of intervention of reality that you can relate to, because we don't all look like models. And sometimes that can be intimidating when you see these beautiful creatures wearing the most gorgeous clothes. You're like, okay, this is great. And I love this. And I love the fantasy. But like, how can I use that in my own world, my own life, and in the sort of quotidian everyday? I always find it interesting and a delight seeing unexpected characters in a show or a campaign or whatever it is, story. But in terms of me and my experience as a model, the thing that I got out of it was being around the people and listening to John and Pat McGrath talk about the makeup. And it was like a recreation of the Margiela show. And they were just saying one word to each other. They were just like, poison, arsenic. And I was like, what are you talking about? But I was also trying to be involved. I was like, yeah, John was laughing. And then suddenly was like, when the glue goes on, you're not going to be able to speak. And I was like, oh, yes, I do know that. And then when he saw Tom, my husband, who was working with John, doing some styling for him at Margiela, Tom went in on the Monday or whatever. And then John was like, oh yeah, Tish was amazing. It was great. And he was like, the best part is she doesn't shut up. She couldn't talk with all the glass makeup. That was a funny one. But it was like being around these amazing characters and like just seeing pure genius occur was an honor and a privilege that I'm very grateful for.
I would assume there's also a power being on the other side, right? What does observation give you that the participation role doesn't?
I've always been an observer. That's been my natural role. I was so painfully shy as a kid. I literally couldn't speak to people. Now I can't shut up. But I really found it hard. And having that distance, it just felt a lot safer. So you're observing someone and then you go away and you write and you're in your own world and you're the master of your own kingdom. It was a natural fit. And the idea of being in a world where you have to perform was so alien and terrifying. So I think for me, it feels the most authentic to write about people, places, and things. That said, I love being a part of those on the other side. One is just being very much in touch with yourself and your ideas and how you're going to tell someone else's story. Whereas the other one is being a part of that story.
You certainly do both well in terms of not only those runway moments, but your campaign covers. It's all pretty spectacular. There was a question that you asked Amanda Harlick, another favorite female figure that we've had on the show earlier this year during a conversation. And I wanted to flip the switch on you, which we've somewhat touched upon, but I feel like it's worth exploring as a question on its own. So for anyone listening who has ever felt like an outsider, especially young women, what advice would you offer about self-expression, identity, and finding your voice?
I would say to lean into the weirdness, lean into the strangeness, because it's actually a superpower. And I think you will be able to find so many like-minded people. Connecting with someone who is like-minded is such an empowering thing. There's definitely been moments where I've tried to be somebody who I definitely am not, and it's never felt authentic. It's always felt weird, and I've come crawling back to my true self. So I would say lean into the darkness, lean into the sadness, and you will be able to turn it into your strength. And there's so many people out there who think the same, more than you would think. So you're doing great, sweetie.
I love the way you speak in such power with a humorous twist at the end every time. It's such a beautiful paradox. So we have to ask you, as we do all of our guests, Tish Weinstock, what is contemporary now?
God, this question, I was like, do I want to sound very smart or do I want to give a really Miss Worldy answer? Thinking about what should I say, and like I was getting really into how I would come across. And then I was like, no, I should obviously just be honest. And then I was like, that's obviously what I think is contemporary, and that's honesty, radical honesty. We live in this world of hyper curation where brands are sucking on the teats of celebrities, magazines are sucking on the teats of brands. Like we're all chasing each other and lying to each other about how great life is. I think we all just need to be a bit more real and a bit more honest about who we are and what we want and what we're scared of. And I think culturally, people that are doing that, it feels really refreshing. I think Charlie XCX does that. She's very much like herself. She's unapologetic. I think Lorde is like that. I think it's Leah saying like, I wasn't invited to the Dior show. I think that just feels really refreshing. I've fully seen influencers go and sit on seats where they were not meant to be sitting and having their friends take pictures of them. It's all such a lie. And obviously I participate in it as well on Instagram. And so this is a lesson for me also to actually just be more true to yourself and be more honest. Because I think we're all feeling like that. I think we're all a bit over the lies. So yeah, a bit more honesty. Maybe that is quite Miss Worldly, but I'm going to go with it.
It was great. I loved it. Thank you so much for this conversation and taking the time with us today. I had a blast.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of What's Contemporary Now. A special thanks to our producer, Sasha Grinblatt. Audio post-production by Chase Coughlin with original theme music by Joseph Topmiller and Chase Coughlin of The Black Soft. And visual design by Aaron Meager and Graham Prentice. Subscribe now to be the first to catch new episodes each week. And if you've enjoyed listening, we'd love to hear from you. Leave us a review and let us know your thoughts. Your feedback helps us improve and reach more listeners like you. Follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn for additional content and join the conversation. Let us know what you think is contemporary now.